everybody, and welcome back to another edition of the Physiotutors Podcast. Today, I'm speaking with Ryan Timmins, a researcher and educator from the Australian Catholic University, researching hamstring injuries more specifically with elite level athletes. Ryan, look, that's a very quick overview of you. Why don't you give us a little 1-2 minute intro for the listeners, and then we can just dive on in.
Thanks, Sonny. Great to be here. So I guess, as mentioned, my background is the work I'm doing at the moment is focusing on researching hamstring injuries, a range of things from prevention all the way to rehab and identifying risk factors. But I'm not a physiotherapist. I'm actually a sports scientist, strength and conditioning coach, and a lot of the research tends to focus on applying those principles of strength and conditioning to injury prevention and rehab, and trying to make a dent in something that takes a lot of cash out of the pockets of physios and players with injuries and rehab with the hammy stuff. So that's kind of where we are in the moment, trying to bridge that gap.
Great. But again, thanks for being on here. So a lot of your research is surrounding the hamstring. Maybe can you talk us through a little bit of the anatomy of the hamstring, sort of important factors that you've had to take into account when looking at that, analysing it and seeing how you're going to make up your research and what aspects you're looking at and stuff?
Yeah, I think my biggest area has been looking more at the structure of the hamstring and specifically the muscle fascicles. Mm-hmm. So muscle fascicles are obviously a bundle of muscle fibers, and our theory from that side of things is focused around the concept that longer fascicles probably are better suited to withstanding repeated eccentric contractions or muscle damaging contractions. And so typically say when we're sprinting, we hypothesize there's an eccentric contraction in the hamstrings to slow down the swinging shank. And then we do that repeatedly and we cause little micro damage and micro trauma. And the theory with the fascicle lengths is the longer the fascicle, the greater ability we have to withstand damage, and especially eccentric damage. And obviously, everyone's fascicles are adaptable. You can change size of muscles. You can make muscles bigger, smaller, and all that kind of stuff. And so we can actually modify those fascicles in response to training, following injury, and surgery, and all those kind of things as well. So that's been the biggest part of our focus on the research side of things and the stuff that I've done most of my work on. We've specifically looked at the biceps femoris long head as the main hammy that we've focused on, just purely from the fact that it probably makes the majority of injuries that we get, and it's also a majority of the sprinting-based injuries. So it kind of fits that anatomical, theoretical model of, okay, if we've got a muscle that's getting damaged more during sprinting, is it possibly going to be at a greater risk than one that doesn't get damaged as much? So, and I think if you look at the anatomical side of things, you can compare the length of fascicles between the medial and the lateral hamstrings. So we know if the biceps femoris, they've probably got some of the shorter fascicles within the hamstring group. So by having a shorter fascicles, they might actually be at a greater risk of muscle damage than compared to, say, our semitendinosus, which has quite long 24, 25 plus centimeter fascicles. So maybe in that sprinting based kind of injury, there is something within the muscle structure that we have to consider when trying to, I guess, modify the risk of injury moving forward.
Okay. So you mentioned right at the end that the modifying the risk factors. What are the modifiable and non-modifiable ones that we can sort of look at for, let's say, the physios listening to this or other researchers listening to this? What risk factors can people look at to say, okay, this is what I can help with, this is where I can add my 2 cents for this particular population?
Yeah, I guess I think there's a range of factors out there, and I know a lot of my work has been done on muscle fascicles, and we've found that having shorter muscle fascicles can increase your risk of future injury than those that have longer ones. So those that are longer are less likely to get injured than those that are shorter. We've seen a similar kind of story with measures of eccentric strength, typically done during the Nordic hamstring exercise on the Nord board. Mm-hmm. And so we've seen those measures of eccentric strength, those that are weaker tend to be at a greater risk of injury than those that are stronger. Now that area is kind of a bit there's no big consensus there. So for example, in the work that we did in soccer players, we found a good story kind of mixing those that were weak were more likely to go get injured subsequently from there. But we've seen stuff in rugby union players and Gaelic athletes and Australian football players that show that these cohorts that are much stronger, then maybe weakness doesn't seem to be a big factor because it's hardly common to be weak. Because your rugby union guys in eccentric strength testing, it's rare for them to be below 400 newtons. So if they're already strong, what do you focus on? And that's kind of where your other measures such as managing high speed running, increases in spikes and those things, and also the stimulus to improve muscle fascicle length as well. So yeah, so I guess putting the strength and conditioning hat on, we know there's a range of ways to make someone stronger, and it's how you actually achieve that might be the factor that could possibly influence the risk of injury. So we know that muscle architecture or muscle fascicles in specific adapt differently to different contraction mode stimuli. So if we have a concentric driven contraction mode versus an eccentric driven training stimulus, our architecture will adapt differently, but yet we'll still get stronger. So if someone is strong, then it's probably modifying those small levels of how much you drip feed different types of contraction modes into their program to possibly offset the risk of injury moving forward. And then if at the professional level, obviously we have the ability to monitor everything that everyone does. And we know that having greater amounts of changes in high speed running meters from week to week can actually double your risk of injury. So even not at an elite level, you take that down to managing your sub-elite or your recreational athletes, then you're trying to make sure that you do have just a small stepwise progression in those high speed meters and trying to reduce any of those large amounts of spikes.
Okay. How is it you measure that then?
Yeah, good question. Obviously, the best one is GPS. The GPS is the best to run and manage your high-speed meters. But if you're at a local footy club or a local sporting organisation and you don't have GPS, you can use arbitrary measures such as rating of perceived exertion. So you can do like an RPE out of 10 for the session, and then you can measure the time of the session. That gives you an overall idea of the load of that session. Now, it doesn't really give you an idea of the high speed work done because you can't really classify. It's kind of an overall session thing, but it allows you to give just like an overall measure of load or what was done, how long it was done, and how you may have responded to that. But the best measure is GPS, and if you have access to that, looking at speeds above 24 kilometers an hour and managing that. So we've seen if you increase that speed done or that work done above 24 kilometers an hour, almost if you go from say 500 to 750 meters week to week, you can absolutely double your risk of injury from there. So GPS seems to be the easiest way to measure that, but if you have access to it, it's a good tool.
Okay. You mentioned the 24Ks there. Is that it is might sound a bit nitpicky from my side. Is that a not hard and fast border, but is that a tipping point that you see quite often in the research, that when you start taking players over this number, we won't call it a magic number, but when you start getting over these speeds because of the load that it's then putting on the hamstring, that you then start to see more correlation onto injury?
I think it's how you get there. I don't think the absolute value is going to be the kind of the golden silver bullet, whatever you're going to call it. I feel like it's how you get there. If you've gone straight from having a high speed dose of 80% of your max velocity, and then next week you go to 98%, that big jump and that big spike is going to definitely have an issue. And we know from some musculoskeletal modeling work that there's a big jump in the amount of eccentric work that the hamstrings do between 80% and 95% of max velocity. I think it's something around about 60% of the hamstring negative work is done when running at 80% of max velocity. And then when you increase that velocity up to 95%, it's something like almost 92, 93%. So you can almost add an extra 30% of eccentric work done by only increasing 15%. So, when you say, okay, your return to play marker might be repeat sprint efforts at above 80%. Well, actually 80% of repeat sprint effort may only be pushing the hammy to 60, 65, 70% of max. So you need to really try and get that decent high above 90, 95% of max velocity to kind of give you that, I don't call it protection, but to at least prepare the athlete or prepare the person for what they might get exposed to. I guess it's always plan for the worst case scenario. But if they can't handle 95%, then maybe you've got to consider maybe a bit more time to try and get them there, because that extra 30% of negative work that the hamstrings do may be a big factor when returning them to play.
Yeah, absolutely. When you're driving the hamstring right up towards its limit, you're going to be asking a hell of a lot more. So I suppose that's where you mentioned earlier, when you're bringing it down to the sub-elite or Gen Pop, that using the RPE scale is going to give you a good indicator of, hey, are they playing now or running now in that area that we need to start talking about? Watch the way that you ramp up into those speeds. Okay. And then what about things like fascicle length? How can I take that into clinic?
Yeah, it's quite hard. It's one of those things that you've got to have a spare 12 months up your sleeve to try and get good at it, because it is ultrasound derived. So you've got to basically stick an ultrasound in the back of someone's leg and take a photo. So unless you're a researcher or you've got someone who has no social life, then you've probably got to develop alternatives. And at the moment, there's no real alternative to measuring muscle fascicle length. So I guess when people ask me about it, I say the best thing to do is just assume everyone's short and everyone has short fascicles, and that they will respond positively to eccentric training. So how you moderate that and how you actually know your case by case basis might be a bit different. And that's when you've got to kind of get, okay, you've got a guy who's got an ACL Rico on one leg. He doesn't really like doing a Nordic because it puts that compression on his knee. Okay, can I give him another eccentrically overloaded exercise? Can I give him some kind of slider or a 2 up, 1 down back extension or something along those lines to still overload him eccentrically? And so I think that's probably going to be your best approach. We've seen some kind of suggestions out there that maybe you could use like muscle soreness or DOMS as a measure of fascicle length. And obviously it's a very rudimentary and poor kind of accuracy, but it kind of lines up with the theory in that those that have shorter fascicles will probably respond to muscle damage worse than those that have longer fascicles. But the issue with those kind of things or measures of, say, range of motion or those kind of stuff, like passive or active knee extension, is that they're measures of joints. Whereas when we do our fascicle length measure, it's a measure of one muscle. So obviously with knee flexion, you have 6 muscles that do knee flexion. So they're all going to contribute to passive active knee extension range of motion, or some measure of DOMS or soreness. Whereas we take fascicle length measures from one muscle at a couple of sites. So it does have a few limitations, but I guess my biggest thing, and I say for those, that even if you're trying to apply it at the local sporting organisation level, is just assume everyone is short, and then once you kind of feel out the athletes, and then you can modify each person individually and move from there.
Okay, you sort of touched on already what was going to be my next question following on from that. What exercises would you be using to help stimulate that fascicle length? So you mentioned the Nordic curls, or if someone's not confident, you're 2 up, 1 down. Are there any other exercises that you guys have utilized within the research that you think definitely be some strong wins that you can gain from that to help increase that?
Yeah, I think we've done some really good stuff we've found some really positive adaptations. I mean, with a 45-degree hip extension on a Roman chair kind of thing, and I said with 2 up, 1 down, it gives you that extra eccentric overload. We've actually just finished some stuff using the K-box flywheel device. So it's like a inertial flywheel, which is basically driven by the resistance. So it's basically a wheel, and you've got a wrap that goes around the axle, and then the harder you pull up on the axle, the more of the wrap goes around it, and it rips you down on the way down. So the faster you do the concentric phase, the greater the eccentric resistance is. And we've actually found some good stuff. So the K-box is, you set it up for a variation. We did like a hip hinge variation, and we've seen a lot more activation in the biceps femoris during hip-based movements than we have with knee-based stuff. So we thought, okay, if we can hook that up, and then we can really emphasize that eccentric phase, that's given us some good positive adaptations. We've seen that. But I think if your target's going to be injury prevention, and you're in the local community setting, the Nordic is probably the easiest to do. But in saying that, not everyone responds, not everyone likes it because of their knees. The effort sometimes doesn't match the outcome. And I guess coming from an Australian strength and conditioning perspective, a lot of our research is done using the Nordic, but the emphasis is on intensity, and every effort is close to 100%. So if it's not being done properly, then you've got to question why you're doing it. And on top of that, I think there's starting to be a lot of good stuff coming out of Spain and France, looking at sprinting and sprint training, and how that actually drives some positive adaptations, just from a training intervention, not from a performance perspective, but actually from adaptation, get you stronger, having longer fascicle lengths and things like that. So actually prescribing some sprinting processes within training, as well as having the gym stuff, seems to be quite positive.
Okay. So obviously you're looking at all the different ways to help encourage that lengthening of the fascicles. During your research, you're also looking at different ways of training eccentric, concentric, isometric. Do you notice any major differences between when people come in and start the research that you guys do with them? Any differences that they say, oh, actually, I train mostly in this way? Or I suppose kind of what I'm getting at there in a roundabout way is, do you notice that if people train more so concentrically they're at higher risk of injury rate? Do you see that in your research for people who've come into you guys, or?
I think the biggest thing we've seen is not so much the off-field thing; it's been more the on-field stuff. And most of the guys that come into us that we see with research are probably a level or two below elite. So they're not sub-elite. Well, they're not semi-professional. They get paid a little bit on the side, but they train twice a week and they play on a Saturday. So they're good, but they're not going to win the World Cup anytime soon. But they typically manage the gym stuff okay, and they respond. They'll be doing eccentric work, whether it's a Nordic or whether it's an overloaded back extension or something along those lines, and they typically do them quite well. But it's the on-field stuff they struggle at managing, because when you get down to those levels where you don't have an S&C coach or a sports scientist saying don't run, all that kind of stuff, you don't really track it that well. And that's typically where we see them not responding the best, is when we get them out and start trying to sprint them and start trying to push them a bit more. They go, okay, that's 90%, that's 95%. And so that side of things, I think, can be managed a bit more. But if you've got the right resistance training stuff to support that, and actually build them up before you push them out there, then that obviously helps the program a bit. But yeah, I think that's the biggest thing we've seen is the on-field or return to play, return to training kind of scenarios.
That was going to be another question as well. So what are the most frequent injuries that you guys would see for people coming in for the research? Would it be contact injuries, non-contact injuries, or?
Yeah, typically ours are sprinting, but with Australian rules football as being probably the biggest cohort of athletes that we get, there's this big mechanism where they're bending over to pick the ball up. So they're in hip flexion and they're sprinting while they're doing that. So they're sprinting at a decent pace. They're bent over to pick the ball up, and then they're just gone from there. So that seems to be a typical mechanism for us. But otherwise, we still see your pretty stock standard sprinting, sniper, down I go, grab the back of the leg and way off the field we go. But we do see a few of the rugby guys coming in that get forced into hip flexion, and then have some avulsion injuries coming, because obviously they get pulled into hip flexion and sometimes the hamstring comes off the bone.
Yeah.
And they're always interesting cases, because then there's a big hole in the back of the leg where the hamstring used to be. So, and they typically be the older guys as well. But yeah, so I think it's a mixture of them. I think you take your typical soccer ones. We're getting a few more like decelerating ones nowadays. We never used to really get the decel ones, or what they perceive to be a deceleration. Whether we don't have video from it, but they might be decelerating and cutting, or they might have been trying to slow down to beat somebody and then they felt it go. Yeah, whether that's just that we've had that in the last 12 months and that's been something I've noticed, or whether that's a trend actually happening, I don't know. There's been a bit of conversation within the AFL, or the Australian Rules Football over in Australia, about there's no longer your 4 to 6 week hamstring injury anymore. Everyone seems to be getting 12 to 16 week hamstring injuries. They all seem to be having intramuscular tendon involvement. And so everyone's hypothesizing about why, and they're all blaming the strength and conditioning coaches and saying everyone's too strong and the tendon keeps tearing because they're too strong. And I don't think there's any evidence to say that's the case, but it does raise an interesting point that we know that proximal tendon actually doesn't, or the proximal aponeurosis doesn't actually match the size of the muscle. And so if you think of it as a force generator and a force transmitter, your muscle generates the force, and then the force goes to the aponeurosis, which goes to the tendon, which then creates movement. If the generator, the muscle, is too big to match the transmitter, then in theory, the transmitter is going to fail at its weakest point. And there's been a few papers doing that in musculoskeletal modeling. They found that proximal tendon is actually quite unable to respond to strain as well as others. And so a lot of people have used that as support to say, well, if you get too strong, then maybe the tendon's at risk here. But I don't know how we do that. Do you say just stop making people strong?
And then we go back to muscle injuries, and
and you get your 4 6-weekers back, but you get 30 of them instead of having three 16-weekers. So yeah, I think we want to start doing some isometric stuff, and in theory, there's a lot, and especially in the physio realm, there's definitely a lot of stuff with isometric training and tendons and helping to improve cross-sectional area. But my theory is still, if you're contracting isometrically, there's a muscle involved at some point. It's not just happening without the tendon, without the muscle. So I think that's a developing area we need to work on. And I don't think we can put it down to purely being too strong and blowing up the tendon. I think there needs to be a bit more work on that.
Absolutely. I think everything's got to start with a theory, I suppose, for them to either back it up or, show that, hey, there's nothing there at all. But do you think that, with that said, there might be a place then for isometric strength training for some athletes following injury rehab once they're, whether they're back to play or whether it's in their off season or what? Do you think there is a place for, hey, we do train you eccentrically, we should also train you concentrically, and we should also do some iso work as well?
Yeah, and I think in an ideal world, you don't just have one exercise, and there's, in a season, depending if you're in the AFL or whether you're in elite soccer, it's a 30 to 40 week season. So you're not just going to do one exercise for that whole period. And I think having a holistic approach is definitely something that needs to be considered. And I think how you achieve that is probably the art of the programming, and why some people get paid the big bucks is to figure out when they can do the eccentrics, when they should do isometrics, when they should do a hip and knee exercise, and how you manage their high speed work. So I definitely think doing one exercise isn't going to solve everything, despite what a lot of researchers believe. But I do think that we need to consider that the best evidence to reducing the risk of injury is an eccentric stimulus. Now, whether that's just your base, okay, you've got to do that, and then you add on stuff around that depending upon the person. You go, okay, maybe he's had a history of medial ham issues, or he's had an ACL reco, so we need to bulk up his medial hammy. So we'll give him some more knee dominant stuff and probably some concentric work, because that's better for hypertrophy. But he still needs that eccentric stimulus. He still needs to keep that as a base. And then, whether you drip feed some isometric stuff in there, I think, yes, I'm all for that. But then I also wonder, maybe sprinting training, modifying that and controlling that is probably pretty good as well. But and again, you've got 40 week season. How do you control that across the season? I think that holistic approach, that holistic plan, is probably better than just saying one exercise will cure all. I don't think we will just do that.
No, I think that if there was one magic exercise, then it'd be game over for a lot of us, wouldn't it? There'd be no more research, there'd be no more injuries, no more physios, nothing. I don't know if I'm for that or against it. You have to come back to me on that. But you mentioned there the sort of 40-week seasons, and just before we hit record, we were talking about the turnarounds between game time and between the different games. Do you, or in your research, have you guys looked at any of the programming and how you can adjust to take that into account, to factor that in if there's quicker turnarounds?
Yeah, so we did a study. We've done a couple of studies now looking at a low volume training approach from a Nordic hamstring exercise. Yes, because it's the easiest one to do. And looking at, basically, we dosed them up in a 2-week period. So we gave them twice a week, 4 sets of 6, and they went heavy, they went hard. So that first 2 weeks, they've done 150 plus Nordics in the first 2 weeks. And then after that, they've only done 1 session, 2 sets of 4. And so they're once a week, 8 repetitions, and they're also done at a good intensity. But it saves people having to do 30 plus repetitions. If you follow the evidence-based Nordic prevention protocols that say that, okay, in season you do at least 1 session of 3 sets of 10. It becomes very hard to do when you've got a 3, 4, 5 day turnaround. In a 7-day turnaround, yeah, you should be able to do it. But we found that our low volume approach is actually quite beneficial from a strength and a fascicle length adaptation when compared to a high volume approach. So we did another comparison study right next to it where we gave guys up to 180 repetitions in a week across 6 weeks. So we absolutely smashed them.
Yeah.
And then the low volume group did 8 reps a week after a little preseason. And then, both groups got strong. Not one didn't get stronger than the other. Both groups got longer fascicles, not one longer than the other. So we found that as good evidence to say, okay, well, that preseason probably gives you a good push in the right direction, and then that 2 sets of 4 kind of keeps you going, keeps you in the right path. We've now a follow up to that, and so that, I guess, the kind of take home from that is that a low volume training program after a small little preseason stimulus is enough to maintain those adaptations. But we've actually done a follow up to that now where we've gone, okay, let's do intermittent. So we'll go preseason stimulus, week on, week off, week on, week off of 2 sets of 4. And that's the adaptations aren't there. We see them, you don't kind of maintain the strength, people get sore, and then the actual adaptation becomes not actually non-significant adaptations for us. So I think the take-home message would be provide a good stimulus up front, get the soreness out of the way, adapt, and then maintain that eccentric stimulus in season. Because as soon as you take it away, you're going to find people getting sore again. Then there's going to be compliance issues, and then there's going to be problems which just feel not doing it, and you find yourself going down the rabbit hole, and then trying to come out of it and when to reprogram it becomes hard. So I think if you appreciate what exercises cause the soreness, and then at least try and get them adapted in that smaller period before you roll into in-season stuff. And in season, if you've got a 3, 4, 5 day turnaround, you can get away with a match day plus or match day -3 training session, just to get that in there so they don't drop off. Because if you drop off, then you're playing catch up again.
Okay. Did you notice anything, regardless of a high volume or low volume, and their perceived exertion on match days or their soreness post-match day at all, or fatigue levels?
Not really. I think we've seen some stuff. We've done some stuff with AFL players, and we've seen doing the Nordic actually improves, doing training intervention improves 5-meter sprint time. So it actually makes you better at accelerating. Not just us, there's been guys in Scandinavia that found the same thing. So at least it has a performance benefit as well. But from a fatigue or from a DOMS point of view, there's nothing that kind of stands out from there. But the exercise on its own seems to add some prevention stuff. And also there's probably about 2 or 3 studies now saying, okay, it's not just prevention, it also helps you run a little bit quicker as well.
Okay. Changing gears a little bit now. You mentioned earlier on the chaps who have the avulsion issues and how that can change the muscle belly. What about people who are post ACL reconstruction where they've used some of the semi-10? How does that affect things for the hamstring architecture, the power output, and all the rest of it?
Yeah, so I think where a lot of stuff we see and obviously across the literature, there's lots of strong evidence to suggest if you take a semitendinosus with or without gracilis graft to then rebuild the ACL, there's strong evidence to suggest you don't really get that cross-sectional area or muscle volume back in that surgically repaired limb in that semitendinosus. And so obviously that's quite abrupt. So following surgery, there's big deficits. And then I think the furthest out someone's tracked it has been about 380 weeks post-surgery. There's still huge deficits between limbs. So it seems that the semitendinosus as a whole doesn't really kind of respond or regrow from having half itself chopped out. So I guess you're programming around trying to promote hypertrophy in that muscle. It might be positive that you might try and do that, but you're probably fighting an uphill battle. So I think a lot of the work that we're doing now in the ACL space is trying to do that stuff pre-surgery. So pre-surgical strengthening, trying to promote some changes in muscle mass to hopefully reduce that deficit post-surgery. Just purely from the fact that after post-surgery, it just seems that having cut out, it just doesn't get back, or it becomes quite hard to get it back. We see the same thing. We see in the biceps femoris, we see shortening of fascicles in the ACL reconstructed limb and reductions in eccentric strength in the ACL reconstructed limb. The reductions in eccentric strength are not just us. There's been a few people in female soccer players, female football players. I've done it in male soccer players. And it just seems that ACL reconstructed limb with the semitendinosus, having lesser muscle mass, obviously has a lower ability to produce force when doing knee flexion. And so the semitendinosus is obviously quite a strong knee flexor, becomes quite a limitation. So I think we need to consider that. I think we've seen some positive changes in the biceps femoris as well. So you might have some good adaptations over a period of time with some eccentric work in the hammies. But even looking at some of the ACL literature, there's no real guidelines or time frame on when to kind of start promote hamstring loading. A lot of it centers around the limb and how you actually manage the limb returning to movement and all those kind of things. And there's always, chucking some hamstring stuff here or chucking some hamstring stuff there. So the timing of exercise following ACL reconstruction for hammy stuff is pretty, it's not really covered at all. So I think that's some stuff we want to work on, is trying to see, okay, if we get a bit more aggressive and go, if the surgeons are on board with it, can we actually provide some good hammy stimulus earlier in rehab post ACL reconstruction, coupled with a good pre-surgical intervention? Does that put us in a good space? But we just need to convince the surgeons, I guess.
Would something then in that instance following the surgery, would something like the Fascicle protocol maybe be beneficial to use for the hamstring, just to help get a little bit more length on it and start doing things in a smaller way?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the Fascicle stuff benefit as well is that it's you don't need equipment. You
No.
don't need to. Yeah, you can grab onto the wall or a bookshelf and do it.
Yeah, and it's low loading, so that if, let's say, you are talking to your surgeon and you're talking about how you can start introducing stuff to the hamstring a little earlier, you can say, look, it's no load going through the limb with it. So
yeah. I think we want to try and do that and more. I think we just the hammy just gets lost in the ACL rehab stuff, like especially considering you cut out so much of it to stitch up the knee, and most of the focus is the knee joint, getting the quads going, getting the timing of activation, all that kind of stuff, which is all important. But then they forget, oh, well, we've got to chuck some hammy stuff in there, and they become conservative because they're worried about the graft site and the health of the graft site. But if you can start loading the ACL with some active knee extensions, for example, can we not possibly do an Fascicle thing where we're actually doing a low load thing like that? And yeah, I think that's a space that hasn't been really developed. I think it's just kind of always been an afterthought in the inclusion of hammy stuff in ACL Reco programs. And I think if you get a good bunch of surgeons who are open-minded to that, then I think you can probably do some really positive work in that area.
Okay. And would your suggestion then be more knee dominant hamstring exercises to encourage that growth on the medial side of the hammy, or?
Yes.
Obviously not excluding the hip dominant exercises, but would you?
Yeah. I'm just trying to think, because we've done some exercise profiling stuff where we've taken some exercises and we looked at the functional MRI response. So basically, what a functional MRI gives you is it's a measure of it's basically a measure of how active a muscle is during exercise, and what muscles are actually more active than others in exercises. And so we've seen a lot of stuff where our hip dominant exercises actually use biceps femoris long head the most, but then also have a big emphasis on semitendinosus. And we've seen that, not even I've just seen that, there's been a bit of work done in Belgium when they call the biceps femoris and semitendinosus, teammates, not competitors kind of thing, that paper that came out a while ago. So I think the semitendinosus does get a good stimulus from the hip stuff as well. But yeah, as a general prescription, I think you definitely need a good emphasis on some knee-based stuff. And I definitely think there's going to have to be a hypertrophy-driven program, which will probably be concentric in nature, or whether you start loading it up and going a higher intensity drive program. But I always think the back of my head is based on what we see now, are we fighting an uphill battle? Is just going to be, you achieve so much, but because half the muscle's been chopped out, are you actually just shoot yourself in the foot? But doesn't mean you shouldn't try. But I think there's definitely, if you had to choose, I think some good hip stuff where you can actually overload them, because they'll probably be able to receive that load a bit more than it's knee-based because of the ACL, and then using the knee-based stuff to actually probably promote the hypertrophy as well at a lower load, lower intensity, and put the heavy stuff at the hip, because then the biceps femoris can take some of the load, but the tendinosus still gets the good stimulus from it as well.
Yeah, as a bit of a companion muscle to it.
Yeah.
Okay. And then going on way further down the line, then, what are some of the key things or key indicators for you guys when you're conducting your research in terms of return to play measures that someone could maybe take into practice?
I think the biggest thing is time. I think all the stuff we've seen, it's not just us, and lots of other stuff, it's time. I don't think. I think we've seen a few things. The guys at Aspetar have seen a few things. If you take all your clinical assessments and everything into one, at the end of the day, there's probably some of the work that the guys at Aspetar have found is they call the MH fake, which is the maximal hip flexion, active knee extension. So you're lying on your back and trying to extend your knee as far as you can. They found that kind of gives you a good measure of return to play, or kind of categorizing the recovery between limbs. That doesn't tell you who's going to go on and get injured. It tells you when you can probably return to play, but it doesn't tell you who's going to go on and re-injure. I think the biggest thing they found, and we found, is time. We had stuff that we've done where we've tried to push people through rehab more aggressively, overload them earlier and get some eccentric work into them earlier. And we found that to be positive in reducing re-injury rates. But the issue we always found, those that returned to play before 2 weeks was our 14-day kind of marker. They had a greater rate of re-injury than those that returned to play after 2 weeks. Now, it's not even us. There's some guys that do AFL research in Western Australia, and they looked at the amount of running done in rehab and the amount of high-speed running done in rehab. And they found basically the more high-speed running you can do within the first 2 weeks actually gives you a lower risk of re-injury after that. So it seems to be that 14-day period seems to be possible to actually give you probably a good buffer to get some stuff into. And with us in that 14 days, we've done a bit of work looking at not letting the clinical assessments dictate what exercises you do. So you go in, you look at palpation, you look at active knee extension, you look at isometric strength, and everyone's going to probably have some level of pain or soreness or discomfort on those. And typically within the literature, the argument is, okay, if you've got pain on an isometric contraction, you should probably do less strength work in the gym because it's going to give you soreness and that's going to be an issue. But we've actually found a few things where the clinical assessments don't line up with the exercise response. So someone might respond painfully in their clinical assessment, but then you go and get them to do a back extension and they've got maybe a 2 out of 10 pain response, whereas when you assess them in the clinic, they may have had a 6 out of 10 pain response isometrically. So I think in determining what they can do, I think it needs to be the exercise probably should dictate when they can do the exercise, not so much the clinical assessment. The clinical assessment will probably give you a good idea of function and probably their ability to sprint more than anything, I reckon. But I think if you look at using exercise as a marker and progress and regress within the exercise, so you start 2 legs, then you might go to 1 leg, and then you might overload with that extra weight and things like that. That approach probably allows you to get more into them in a 2-week period. So you respect that 2 weeks, you respect that biological healing. And then after that 2 weeks, you can probably also still get some sprinting stuff into them. And then you're probably going to be pretty well covered in that area. But yeah, I guess if you come back to your initial question, I think clinical assessments for us haven't really lined up with return to play, haven't really lined up with progressions of exercises.
Damn it.
And it's always just, it hasn't for us. And that doesn't mean that it doesn't. It just hasn't in our situations. And we find that try and get as much work into them within the first 2 weeks, respect that healing, and then let the exercise dictate what they can do. If they can do a back extension with moderate levels of discomfort, then see how they go with a bit more weight, things like that. So I think that's been successful for us anyway.
Okay. And are there any sort of indicators for re-injury that you might be able to share with us?
We haven't had, so the downside for us is that what we haven't had is our guys typically either don't get re-injured that often.
That's good, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it's a bonus. So we did a big randomized control trial a couple of years ago where we had 60 odd people, and I think there was 4 got re-injured, which is obviously less than 10%. So we can't really do much stats with that. I know Carl Laskling's stuff, he found that with the H test would be a big predictor of re-injury. Obviously, return to play was a big one, but there was the time to do the H test successfully actually also influenced re-injury rates. But I don't know if there's the guys at Aspetar haven't found much either, and they've been doing a lot of stuff with the central tendon guys. So again, I think it's time. I think if you're pushing guys back before the first 2 weeks and you try and get them back within 14 days, I guess you've probably got to couple that with knowing that they're going to be at risk of re-injury. If you give them a little bit longer, you haven't got the pressures from the coach or whatever on top of you, then maybe that extra time after that 2 weeks will give you a bit more security. But yeah, I think if pushing them back before 14 days and that time will probably be the biggest thing. Like I said before, there's some pretty good evidence to suggest that the extent of high-speed running done in rehab probably also impacts the risk of re-injury. It's not going to predict those, but those that do more high-speed running in rehab are probably going to be less likely to re-injure. So if you take that 14 days as a good period to give them some exercises, to get a bit of soreness, get them adapt, and then try and get some high-speed running into them. There's been some good evidence to suggest that if you do a bit more high-speed running in rehab, then your risk of injury is controlled a bit. So you add that together with time, then it's probably a good story there. It allows you to get a bit more running into them. So time and running seem to be the biggest thing for us, which kind of makes all of the clinicians irrelevant sometimes. Hopefully not.
I have a job after this podcast. Thanks, mate. I hope you don't mind if I move in with you.
No, the Gold Coast is a great place.
And with regards to the sprint work, do you guys utilize any sort of hill sprint work at all, just out of interest from sort of experience of working with sprinters and stuff from athletics? Hill sprints is a big thing that they throw into their work, and I wonder if that would have any influence on any outcomes in comparison to just getting on a track or sprint work in a gym or whatever.
Yeah, so we don't specifically, because most of the work we do is, if you saw our university campus, you'd understand why we can't do much. There's us, there's a tram track, then there's a main road. So there's not much room to do high-speed running. So we have like a little lab-based area that we can get some good speeds. Yeah. But talking with, so Darren Burgess is a high-performance manager in Melbourne. So he used to be in charge at Arsenal, was at Liverpool before that. So he's kind of been around for a while. And so I had a few conversations with him, and he likes to use a lot of high-speed stuff, and the high-speed hill sprint stuff, both up and down. Mm-hmm. He likes the upside from a performance perspective. It helps them actually push them into that triple extension. And then the down to actually give a bit more eccentric loading as well. But yeah, he's found he seems to like it, and he's found to be some good responses with the guys that they just weren't responding to straight sprint stuff. So yeah, that seems to be positive from his side of things, and from a practical side of things, if Darren seems to like it, then I'd probably back him in there. So.
Yeah, fair. Okay, lovely. And sort of rounding things off a little bit, where would you recommend people start if they want to dive deeper into hamstring work? Some reading recommendations, or?
I think in the classical kind of muscle physiology, that stuff for me took a while to get my head around. But once you kind of understand those concepts and those theories, so work of Morgan, I can't remember his surname. Is a Morgan et al. 1990. New understandings of lengthening and muscles, or something like that. So it's a great paper and understands the theory around muscle lengthening and muscle sarcomeres and how they actually may impact injury risk and injury damage, muscle damage. Sorry. That's a big kind of area for me that I've found took a while to get my head around. Once you kind of understand it a bit more, it helps. We've got a couple of reviews that have kind of made it more practically applied. So taking out we've chopped out a rabbit hind foot and we've zapped it and we found this. We've kind of what does that mean to practical side of things? And you can find all that stuff. So I've actually, on my Twitter account, our university's been really good, and they created this open access kind of area where all our pre-published work goes onto. So people can access that free of charge, and any stuff that we've done is all on there.
What's your Twitter?
Ryan_Timmins.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's on there, and it's pinned on my Twitter account. So you can actually go in there, and there's a Google document, and we update every 3 months with all our new papers that come out.
Awesome.
So you can access that, and that gives you just basically free access to the papers. And so in there, there's a review. It's called Architectural Adaptations to Training and Injury, and it gives you the theoretical background around why architecture matters, and how it actually might impact injury, but also impact performance as well. So that's some of our stuff that we've done. I think that's probably a good area to kick off with. And then you can go down the rabbit hole and those kind of things as well.
Lovely. And what's next for yourself in terms of research? What areas are you guys now, post-COVID, going to be diving into? Or, yeah.
I think post-COVID for us is trying to expand the training scheme and the training sphere into injured populations. We do a lot of rehab, we do a lot of prevention stuff, and the prevention stuff are in guys who are in a sporting team, may have had a history, may have not had a history, or rehab stuff where guys have been injured and we need to get back to play and reduce the risk of injury. I think there's a big space for the unknown is those that have had a history, those that have, even if it's had an ACL history, just don't respond the same way as the healthy individuals. And so I think understanding that area much more and much deeper for us is going to be a big work. I think we've already got some evidence to say that in Australian rules, football players who've had a history of injury across a pre-season period, they just don't get stronger compared to those who haven't had a history of injury. So the healthy 18, 19, 20-year-old kids are getting stronger, whereas the 31, 32-year-old veteran with a history of injury isn't getting stronger. And that's coupling with a whole bunch of age and injury history and he's weak. So understanding that a bit more for us is going to grow in the near future. We've got some proximal avulsion work kind of coming with some surgeons in the near future as well, looking at those proximal tendon avulsions and surgeries around that, and how we actually can understand that area a bit more. But yeah, that's probably the world post-COVID at the moment.
Nice.
But we'll have to, when that is, we don't know. So we'll just
have to play the wait and see game. Yeah. Lovely. Well, any other last little bits or bobs? Any other places that people can find you online if they wanted to get in contact?
Yeah, the best place is probably Twitter, Ryan_Timmins. That's probably the best spot to get in touch with me. There's a few other guys in our group that are on there, guys like David Opar, Jack Hickey, Matt Bourne, Stephen Dewey, and the biggest one would be Tony Shield. Tony Shield is the knowledge bank for all of us in our group. He's kind of driven a lot of the work that we've done. So he loves to go in his little battles on Twitter. He's always entertaining to watch when he does get into them. So I definitely recommend trying to get around Tony. His Twitter handle is DAS_Shield. And there's a big backstory behind that. But he
Like German Das, as in that's the shield or
No,
something? Or no?
no, we used to. He was my resistance training lecturer when I was an undergrad student, and we created this movie script about the Shield taking over the world, and it was we got quite bored in our undergrad studies. So anyway, so he took that and ran with it, and now it's his Twitter name. But he's got a knowledge that it's hard to beat, and he'll always tweet just these little nuggets of gold. And I think he's definitely someone people should get around and have a look at too.
Lovely. Oh, great. Thank you very much. Really appreciate your time being able to chat with us as well.
No worries. Thanks for having me on.
Well, ladies and gents, thanks again for listening in, and we'll catch you next time. As always, wherever you're listening to this, we appreciate your time, and if you have any comments or suggestions, feel free to get in contact and let us know. Until next time.